and welcome to Completely Booked, the official podcast of the Jacksonville Public Library. I'm Amanda.
And I'm Gabby. Now, I don't want to preface this podcast too much. I think it's best to just jump into it. But I will say, when Amanda and I first sat down to brainstorm podcast ideas, my mind immediately jumped to our guest today, Mark Ari. You know that feeling you get when you have a really fantastic conversation with someone, one that just inspires you and shifts the lens through which you see the world out of? Well, Ari is pretty notorious for those kinds of conversations, and we thought it would be a wonderful experience to somehow relay that feeling.
We hope that by the end of this episode, you feel inspired to create something, read something, or try something you maybe never would have before. So, without further ado, here is our conversation with Mark Ari.
I'm so excited to have our podcast guest on with us this morning. Mark Ari is a writer of fiction, poetry, and creative nonfiction. He's a performing singer-songwriter. He's a painter. He's the founder and editorial advisor to Flock Literary Journal, as well as Eat, which is a publisher of digital albums and audio chapbooks. He, among so many other things, he's a creative writing professor at UNF, and I personally had the pleasure of taking Ari for a few different courses. And he's just one of those professors that become a lifelong mentor. And Mark Ari is one of the most creative people I know, and has cultivated a huge community of creatives here in Jacksonville. So today we're going to pick his brain a little bit. Ari, thank you so much for being here.
Okay, that sounds a little scary.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we hear that your classes get completely booked up real fast. So if you want a Mark Ari class, you have to sign up for classes immediately.
And I'm running out of dough paying students to sign up for classes, so people say that stuff.
So I don't know, why don't you open up and tell us just a little bit about you? I know that sounds really generic and kind of broad, but just who are you? Who is Ari?
God.
Your childhood, your history, every dark secret. Where did you grow up? Maybe tell us a little bit about the early years.
Well, I was born in Brooklyn, in the Midwood section of Brooklyn. My first generation American. My mother was a refugee, a survivor of Hitler's Europe. A lot of the family didn't survive. My father came up from barefoot poverty in pre-Israel Palestine. So I'm a first-generation American, Brooklyn-born. You can probably still hear it in my voice, although it probably comes out more when I'm angry. Grew up partially there. Then went to high school on Long Island. Been around the world a few times, different places, lived in different places. Really, everything about me is the stuff you already mentioned. That's the only interesting stuff. I write, I paint, I play music. When I travel usually with my guitar. That's how I get by. But I've had exhibits of my paintings in Spain, in France, as well as New York City and other places around. And aside from that, I don't know what's interesting. What would you like to know?
How about when you were little? Is this what you thought you'd be when you grew up? A professor and a painter and a musician?
No. Professor, no. That was an accident. When I was real, it depends on what age you mean when little. When I was real little, like all little boys, I wanted to be a fireman. Then I got a little bit older and I wanted to be an astronaut. And then I wanted to be whatever came across my path that looked exciting, adventurous, or unique. If I was moved by something. Like, for instance, I think it was in high school that I began to really be moved by some writing that I came across. And that's when I started to aspire to be a writer. Then I heard some great people play guitar, and I wanted to play guitar. So I'm still looking for the next thing, I think that's it. I had no ambition to be a professor in any way. It just turned out that way. I love it. Don't get me wrong. I mean, the classes are terrific, and people like Gabby, you get to know them. You become lifelong friends. It's not that kind of thing. I know they tell you that you're not supposed to make friends with your students. It's bullshit. Some of the best friends that I've made over the years are people that I met in classes. Some of the most interesting, intelligent, sensitive individuals I met were sitting in chairs in front of me in a classroom. How could I not become friends with them?
Right.
So it seems like you're pretty amorphous as an artist. You've just whatever sparked your interest, you decided, I'm going to learn that, I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it well. So were there any artists in particular that really, I mean, I know personally that you're a huge Bob Dylan fan. Anybody like that, huge influences that just really kind of sparked you to totally take up a craft?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think you're right. Anytime something has really inspired me, I wanted to be able to do that. I wanted to try to do that. And yet at the same time, I really think of it all as really one thing. And we could talk about that if you're interested at some point.
So that's interesting that you think of them all as one. I was just about to ask you if you had a favorite creative medium or if they're not comparable in that way.
I don't know that I have a favorite. I mean, I tend to write more than anything, but I paint regularly. I play guitar every day. So no, there's really no favorite. I don't think of them as separate things. I think of them as separate dimensions of a single thing. This desire to make a thing,
right.
to put something out in the world, whatever form it takes.
So maybe talk us through your creative process a little bit, like when you sit down to write, where do you start? What do you go for first?
I just try to dirty the screen up with letters. No, really, what it comes down to. I know a lot of people do a lot of planning, and that works for a lot of people, and God bless them that if it does, you got to find your own process, your own method. For me, I need to, whether it's writing or painting or creating a song, I have to just start working. So when I write, I start typing. If I have an idea, it's probably been working in my head for a while, and I just let it go. And I just keep going. And hopefully I try to stop while I still have a little something to say, so I don't go back feeling like I was empty. And for me, it works best when I can do it on a regular basis, when I can go every single day, wake up into it. I used to think I was a night writer, and I used to write all night with a bottle of bourbon. But now I discovered once I became a parent that I couldn't do that, so I started becoming a morning writer, and I found I loved it. Becoming a parent changed everything in all my creative endeavors. So I found that if I wake up and have a cup of coffee, and as I'm waking up with that cup of coffee, out of the dream world of sleep into the dream world of creating, say, fiction. That the transition is easier. I'm more comfortable doing it, and that if I can get a session of 3 or 4 hours in, that's terrific. If I could do that every day, I can make things.
And for your students, so what are some exercises that you assign to your students? Especially, I think your in-class workshops are a little different, but I know you're about to go to London as well, so that's an abroad workshop, and you're sending kids out to museums and gardens and out into London. So what are some of the assignments that you'll give them to help them spark some interest?
Well, first, let me just go back for a second, because I don't want to make you think that everything is just free writing, because it's not. That's the initial creative part, but the writing doesn't really start until I've dirtied up lots and lots and lots of pages, and then it becomes a process of elimination, of moving things around, of having different sentences inspire me in different directions. I might think I have an idea of where something's going when I start, but once I'm in the process, it takes a whole other direction. And sometimes I edit at the end. Sometimes I edit as I go along. I'm a mess when it comes to it, but I'm fully there, fully involved, and that's really I think the most important thing. Now, in terms of what I give students to do, I want them to start thinking outside the box. I want them to stop relying not on the things that inspired them, because we're inspired by all kinds of things. We're inspired by song. We're inspired by TV. Largely inspired by TV. So many of the first things that students write are reflections of those of what they've seen 100 times, 1,000 times on television. How do you get them to break out of that mold so that their own vision can come into play, so they can discover their own language, their voice, so that their voice isn't an imitation of things that they've heard or just common everyday speech that people use all the time to say nothing. The words that they choose that are their own. That form the music of their own particular language. Well, so you've had some of the exercises in classes, right? So I'll do something like the brick exercise, where I'll have students come in, I'll pass a brick around, and people will look at it, they'll touch it, they'll feel it. A few people will taste it. This is a garden brick I've stolen from a neighbor. And I'll ask them as it's going around to write a word of description, to shout out a word of description. I'll write it on the whiteboard. until the whiteboard is full of these words of description. I ask them to be very concrete, no metaphor, no abstraction, just concrete language. And I fill up the whiteboard with those words, and then I ask them to write a letter to the brick describing the brick to itself. They may not use the word brick, and they can't use any of the words on the whiteboard. And the result is fascinating. They are permitted to go now use abstract language, but what happens is this flood of metaphor. And for many students, if you do this early in their writing careers, this is a discovery for them. And and when they formulate these metaphors, often they're very unique, they're special, they're things that only these students could come up with. And that is a hint of the birth of voice. So that's one kind of thing. I can go on and give you more of these, but I don't want to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great example. I think, one of our goals for our listeners is that they would be inspired to write something after hearing you. Because I know for me, it was like leaving every class with you. I was like, I just want to write. I want to go out. I want to write something I've never written before. And so I think that's part of the magic of just hearing you speak. So yeah, maybe go on for.
Well, instead of an example, I want to speak just to what you were just talking about. That people do have this desire to write. People have a desire to write. People have a desire to paint. People have a desire to make music. People have a desire to sing. People can go their whole lives wishing that they would sing, but they're afraid to sing. If there's anything that I want to be able to do, or that I want to help people do, because you can't do it for them, but you can maybe help them, is I want people that dream of writing, that yearn to put words to paper, to start to do that. I want people that want to play an instrument to start to do that. If you want to sing, I want you to sing. I want you to get it out of your head that you can't sing, or everybody can sing, right? And this may not sound like what you particularly wanted to in that moment, but you certainly can, and you have to make a beginning. And then you see what you have to work with, and that's what you shape. When you paint, when I couldn't afford colors to paint or a big space to paint in, I would paint in my apartment in Brooklyn. The biggest space I had was a wall over the stove, so I would climb on the stove, tape the paper to the wall, and I'd paint there. And if I didn't have good paint, I would use cheap paint. And if I didn't have cheap paint, I'd use anything I could dirty that paper with, including, no joke, coffee grounds, just to see how it would work. To make a thing, to make a start. I think people go their whole lives with that unrequited yearning. They shouldn't have to. It's a glorious thing to make a thing.
As a parent myself, I often wonder how to instill a love of reading, a love of art in my son. So as a parent yourself, how would you recommend other parents instill this in their children?
I can only tell you the way I do it. I don't know whether that's a recommendation, because I don't know. Everybody's different, and kids are different. And what I do with my kids is I read to them. My wife and I read to them all the time, from the beginning. From the time before my son was born, I was reading to my wife's belly and playing music to it. And so books were always in the house. I wanted my kids to play an instrument, didn't know how to do it, so I left instruments all over the house. You couldn't walk into a room without finding a ukulele or a banjo or a kid's guitar. And they would pick it up, and then they would want to learn something. I'd help them, and then they'd give it up, and then they'd pick it up again, and they'd give it up. Both my kids became readers. My son is a monster guitarist. So they picked it up. And they always saw us reading, so I guess there's some degree of modeling there. And they found their own paths as well. They read things that I wouldn't have recommended to them, that they recommended to me. And they discovered musics that they turned me on to that weren't initially my interest. So it went both ways.
Do you have any favorite children's book authors?
I'm going to sound corny. I love Winnie the Pooh. I don't know if that's corny. I thought Winnie the Poohs were great. And you can get those really big books, the whole collection of Winnie the Pooh, and I'd read that to the kids over and over again. Then my son, at a certain age, got into things like Captain Underpants. And I know some parents frown about that stuff. I thought it was terrific. And he was inspired to read. So whatever, if he was inspired for a collection, my daughter was inspired by this collection with a a cartoon mouse. Some graphic children's novel, Mouse, with a series, and the name escapes me at the moment. But she loved it, so of course every opportunity I'd bring home another one of those. She was thrilled. It didn't matter to me that what they were. Well, I guess it wouldn't matter if I came home and they were reading something horrific, but that never occurred. They became curious. My son was reading Kafka when he was in junior high school. And asking questions about it. That's something, you know?
Definitely a job well done.
There's no need in me for them to be artists. If I believe in making a thing, so I want them to make a thing, but there are all kinds of dimensions in which you can make a thing, and all kinds of dimensions in which you can be creative. Really, you can be creative in almost any endeavor. And so I just wanted them to be able to take that to whatever they wanted to do. I love the fact that my son plays guitar because he and I can sit down at the kitchen table and play guitar together. That's a daddy's dream, but it's not a requirement. If guitar wasn't his thing, that would be okay. His other enthusiasms are what I want to see. He is a computer science major, and right now, and he loves the idea of game design. He's passionate about it. He feels that the literature of the future is there. So awesome.
Yeah.
You know, so go out there and make a thing. That's what thrills me.
Mm-hmm. And I think, part of your experience being so just diverse, you've dabbled in pretty much every form of art there is. I think that speaks a lot to your arsenal of projects you've done too. I mean, you've done traditional, novel style, literary journals, things like that, but kind of want to touch on EAT a little bit, because I don't quite know how to define it because I haven't seen it before, but I think I like that about it. So for those of you that don't know, eatwords.net is Ari's online
audio
chapbooks, where you'll have local poets and writers actually record themselves reading their work, and then you compile it into a little EP, and then it exists on this platform. I think that's so interesting because while we're moving in such a digital direction, I think, you do have to modify your mediums to fit the times. And so tell us a little bit about where you thought of the idea to do EAT.
Well, the fact that we are moving to digitization is what made it possible. It's much more expensive to put it to create a CD, and before that to create vinyl. So you can make an album now and have it entirely digital and distribute it electronically. And that's the way most people are getting their music. Most people aren't buying CDs anymore. I will buy an occasional CD. My son doesn't buy CDs. My daughter doesn't buy CDs, but they listen to music all the time. So I thought that that was an opportunity. And I like audio. And there's something about the way an author reads their own work that I always found unique. That I found special, that opened up a way of interpreting the work, that allowed me to see the way the author does it. Even if sometimes authors aren't terrific readers of their great work, sometimes they're incredible, but every time is something that tells you something about their work. And so, as you know, I started a number of projects with students. So the literary journal Flock started as Fiction Fix in one of my workshops. Now it's a pretty serious, a well-respected journal. And I've started others that some fell by the wayside, some continued, like Talon Review. And EAT started initially as an audio magazine that was going to be run by students. And I did it for a couple of issues, and then I decided it was hard to get to always have the students graduate, and you have to get new students. So I decided I was going to do this myself, and I was going to remake it. And I started doing EAT Poems. That was the first thing that I did with it, with the EAT Poem series, focused on local poets, not entirely, because I do some New York poets, some Washington poets, because I'm not going to let geography stand in the way of good poetry. But mostly it focuses on people in Northeast Florida, of poets reading their own work. And so once you create it and you distribute it digitally, it's not only on my website. People can find it on Spotify, on Pandora. You can purchase it from Amazon, from Apple Music, from any one of these distributors, from Last FM, and so it gives the poets exposure. From what the poets tell me, they've all been very happy about it. It helps them get readings. Sometimes things that they've read for my chapbooks turn into books that were later published. as long as the poets are glad, I figured this was something I would continue to do because it was kind of special for me as well. I get to record them. I get to spend time on the audio files, getting very close and intimate with the poetry in a way that you normally never do. Hearing a line over and over again as I'm trying to remove that lip smack. And that was a fascinating experience, and so I enjoy it.
I think on that note too, just why Jacksonville? I mean, why is this your creative breeding ground?
Well, because I live here, and I do focus on local authors because, practically because I could go over, meet them, and record them. Not count on them to send recordings to me, but it's more than that. It's part of this whole community thing. And if there's one great thing about the arts community in Jacksonville, is that has developed over the years. When I first came here a bunch of years ago, it wasn't like this. There were pockets, but it wasn't like this. It's a much more active and interconnected scene. And even though to some degree, because I'm so busy with some things, I've had to step away, you can really feel that sense of community. That's a really remarkable thing. And I wanted that. When I came here from New York, that's what I missed most of all, was I depended on the cafes on the Lower East Side of New York, where you could go, sit down, spend whatever it was on a regular cup of coffee, not an expensive fancy cup, regular cup of coffee, and they'd refill it all day long. And you'd sit there and you could work, or you'd meet and talk to people, and everybody was working. And if people are working, it makes you want to work. If people are making things, it makes you want to make a thing. And so I think that's a wonderful kind of environment to have. And you see that in Jacksonville here. There are people everywhere who are making things. And that inspires people to make more things. And out of that, I think some great work is happening. There's terrifically talented people here. Are there more talented people in Jacksonville than other places? No, there aren't. But there are great, wonderfully talented people here. And if I can help that community or help to get the word out on some of them, I want to do that.
And I think there's something pretty special too about kind of being in a budding city that isn't exactly a hub for anything quite yet, but I almost feel like artists can stand out a little more, or it's not as common to find, creative people in every corner. And so I think it really brings them more together in a city like Jacksonville, and it kind of creates a more intimate creative community.
I also believe that artists also have a chance at molding what they want Jacksonville to become, as opposed to where it's, saturated and there's already, expectations at galleries and writing workshops. So I think with Jacksonville, I think there's a lot to be made. There's so much we can do.
No argument from me. There's, but I don't know. I think there's always so much that we can do. I don't know about hubs. I know that I've lived in various cities in the world, and I always manage to find people. And I think that's what it's all about, is finding people that are doing things and that you can have a conversation with, that leaves you with wanting, that resonates with you, that leaves you thinking about it, that leaves you feeling something that later wants to be expressed in some way. And I think that can happen in Brooklyn. I think it happened in New York. I think it can happen in Barcelona. I think it can happen in Madrid. I think it can happen in Chattanooga. And I think it can happen in Jacksonville. And it does happen in these places. We have terrific people, poets, painters, musicians, who are, I don't know what the levels of competition are. If you want to say world class, I would say world class. They're just doing great work. And so I want to see that work. I want to hear that work.
And how would somebody get in contact with you?
Oh, I'm so easy to find. Well, I'm over at UNF, so you can always just look me up at UNF. I think that's probably the best way because I'm also on, you can find me on Facebook. You can find me, I have a website. I have several websites. I have arifiles.com. I have radicaljew.com. I have eatwords.net. I'm about a hard guy to find if somebody wanted to find me.
So I know that as you've said, it's not so much about the place you're at, it's the people you're with. But has there ever been a place that really just ignited something in you that
I don't know if it's place or not. I think there are times where you have to be in a place and times where you have to carry that place within yourself. And I also think it's part of your cultural background as well. I mean, I know people who are Jacksonville artists who have been here, who were born here, whose parents were born here, whose parents were born here. And so there's some kind of connection to place that they feel is very important, very deep. So my family were refugees. And my people moved from country to country, fleeing oppression and hatred for many years. So maybe that's why I don't feel that necessity. I feel like I ought to be able to be at home anywhere. That said, the Lower East Side of New York was really important to me at a certain point in my life. The south of Spain, particularly Seville, was really important to me at a certain time in my life. And Barcelona was important, and Paris was important, and Jacksonville is important. I've been here a long time. I raised a family here. I don't know if I will ever be of Jacksonville, but I am certainly in it, and I'm okay with that.
It sounds like you pretty much have your process down for writing or creating art, but would you recommend somebody check out like a self-help book on how to write? Or
yeah, there's some books that I think could be really helpful to people. I didn't come up that way. I was very fortunate to meet writers who became mentors and painters who became mentors, but there are Stephen King's book. I'm not a tremendous Stephen King advocate, but his book touches on some really important things that I think beginning writers or ought to know, and that would be very, very helpful to them. What else?
A Dash of Style. I just remember that from the...
A Dash of Style was interesting because it's a book on punctuation, and students expect that to be a hideous experience. But many found that illuminating because it took them beyond. It's important to learn what your materials are, and part of your materials as a writer are things like punctuation. Punctuation are the cantillation marks. They're the marks by which people learn to sing the songs, sing what you're writing the way you mean them to be sung, and so they're important. But there's something that goes beyond. You first have to learn to be correct, and then you have to be able to go beyond correct. And A Dash of Style shows real terrifically some examples of how you go beyond correct. For instance, I want my students to be able to use the artifice of quotation marks for dialogue and how to paragraph. But there are great writers like Jose Saramago who do away with that stuff, who you can read a single paragraph. We'll have three people talking, no paragraphing, no artifice of quotation marks whatsoever, but you never lose a thread of who is speaking when, because he's developed character and voice so effectively. So I want students to know that these things are malleable. But you have to you don't want to make a choice because you don't know how to make a choice. You want to be able to make a choice because this works better for what you're trying to do. And I think Dash of Style represents that. And the students, I started using it when it first came out, and students have loved it so much that I continue to use it. There's a danger in books like that as well, because everything. It's written from one author's perspective. I think he did a great job, but it is a perspective. And so many students will read it and it becomes prescriptive. And as an artist, you need to be able to put the prescription away, and mix your own alchemy. Right?
Yeah, I feel like that's kind of relevant because I receive so many emails and so many text messages that are not punctuated at all, and everything comes in and it's lowercase, and I just feel like the art of punctuation is... Now it's your style if you don't want to use it, or if you don't want to write capitalization.
If you don't use it because you don't know how to use it, that's not style.
Right. And I'm not saying that these people don't know how to use it. It's just that, they prefer to write in lowercase. instead of like capitalizing sentences.
And there are writers that do that,
Yeah.
and have some purpose to it.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I like to look for in my students for a discernible purpose for the choices that they're making.
Mm-hmm.
And if I don't see a discernible purpose, I'm not going to assume that there isn't one, but they have to explain it to me.
Yeah.
So I feel like being a creative writing professor, those must be some of the hardest papers to grade because there's no formula. I mean, you're basically telling them to kind of break barriers and just be creative. But then again, you have to sort of hold back the reins and give them feedback. I mean, you are there to be constructive and to tell them to change things here and there. Like, how do you navigate the grading process for creative papers?
Yeah, well, that is hard. As you know, I give extensive critique, and I discuss what I'm thinking about the work, when I'm thinking it, and why I'm thinking it, and I offer alternatives, but it's never prescriptive, except for things that are a matter of correctness, it's difficult. I'm what you would call, I'm not an easy grader or hard grader. I'm a reluctant grader. I would prefer not to grade. I would prefer just to critique, to have conversation. I don't want to. I prefer not to assign A, B, C, or what have you, because then it becomes that's what the student is concerned about. But that's what they want us to do, and so I do that. And I guess there's an argument for it, but not as an artist. If I have a student that really wants to work, for whom writing has become really important to them, I don't want to deal with grades. I want to sit down and talk about their work. I want to talk about what's grabbing me, the way great books grab me, or what's losing me, and I want to know, and I want to explain to them why I'm feeling lost, and then they make their own decision. If that makes sense to them, how they might change it. I might offer alternatives. I mean, you know that. I will, not to rewrite a student's work, but I'll take a sentence and rewrite it 3 different ways to show them 3 different ways of writing the sentence with the same general meaning, but a different music, perhaps. Or it works within the music of the paragraph in a different way, and then they make their choice. So it's a lot of work, much more than if I was just grading the papers for, this shouldn't have a comma splice here, circle that and say comma splice, that's a piece of cake, but that's boring as hell. I don't want to do that. If it matters to students, what they're doing, I want to help them whatever way I can get to that next step. And there's no easy way of doing it. There's no slow way of doing it. And it's not a single step at a time. Sometimes you got to fall back a couple of steps. That's a hard thing for students to learn, that they do spend all this time on a revision and it comes back and I'm telling them, I like the first one better. But that's the way it is. You don't do 1 revision. You don't do 2 revisions. You do 5, 6, 10, 14 revisions. And after, you have to step back, step here. You get somewhere, and finally, maybe you never finish, but you make it end. Because that's as hard to do as it is to start, is to stop.
It seems that you hold a lot of responsibility at a very pivotal time in a student's life. So, I mean, how do you feel about inspiring the next generation of writers and doers when it is at such a pivotal point in their life?
I love the work. I don't know whether I inspire anybody. You'd have to ask my students to find out if that were true. And you'd have to ask my students a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, if anything that we did in the classroom made any difference whatsoever. I don't know. I hope it does. I hope that the experience was a good one, whether they become writers or they take what they've learned into whatever other endeavor. Because as I said, you can be creative in any endeavor. But they have the answer to that. I haven't got a clue. I hope it makes a difference. If you asked earlier about the different things that I do, and I've always wanted to do I've always felt inspired to do what it was that moved me, either that compelled me emotionally or even intellectually. I always that inspired me to want to do it too. And I think once you're really inspired, once you feel that, once you know what it's like to live in the world in that state of inspiration, there's nothing more that you could ever possibly ask of anything that you do, whether you write, whether you paint, whether you make music, whether you teach, whether you do television, whatever endeavor is to be able to do that for somebody else, to inspire them. I don't think there's any higher goal.
I think one of your biggest pieces of advice that's always sort of stuck with me is no matter what it is, if it's an opportunity to write well. I may paraphrase that a little bit, but I just always think, even when you go to write a Facebook status, it's a chance to write. You're putting words out into the world, and you need to do it well. Has that always been kind of a personal phrase that stuck with you? And if so, how has it evolved over the years?
I don't know when I started feeling that, but I do know that I do feel that. Whatever you do, you have to put yourself into it completely, abandon yourself to it. And that's what I mean by write well. Correctness is only a part of it, but it is putting your whole heart and mind into whatever it is that you're doing. When you want to lose yourself in your writing, you want to lose yourself in your painting, you want to lose yourself in your music. I think in any endeavor, you want to give everything that you have in order to have that experience, that the build up and release, of putting out everything that you possibly can into the world at this moment in this particular way. I think it connects you to life. It doesn't matter what you do, but it connects you to that broader humanity or the world, to participate fully, to lose yourself in what you're doing. So that's what I really mean by it. If you're gonna write, damn it. If you're gonna paint with every part, not just your fingertips and a brush. Paint with your heart. Paint with your mind. Paint with everything that you've ever experienced and everything that you ever hope to experience. And the same with any endeavor, I think.
Well, I'm inspired. I'm going to go right now.
Right? And that was, Amanda and I are quite new at the podcast, and immediately I just thought Ari, because I after every class with you, I just felt this urge to go make something, whether it was a poem or just scribbling on a notepad or whatever it is. And I just thought it would be such a cool experience to have the listeners kind of hear what some of us are so lucky to have heard for semesters on end. And I think that speaks too to the community that you've built. There's a Facebook page for all of your former students, and it's just kind of, even if you didn't have a class with them, you just have that bond. We have kind of this shared sort of experience, and then it connects you with other writers, and you see, different projects that they're working on, and sometimes they're looking for help, and it's just this huge network that
I love that.
Centers around you. And I know it's not, you don't want it to be like but it is you. You really just have this way of sort of bringing creative people together in a way that I haven't experienced before. Well,
there is something quite wonderful about these people that don't even know each other, who feel part of a community, and the whole idea was, the whole hope is that people will be there to encourage one another, to help one another, and I think they do. People share job opportunities. People talk about publishing opportunities, because many of my students who were one-time students are now editors of literary journals. And so they'll get on there. We're looking for this, I think that's terrific. I can't take any real credit for that. It's just I'd like to take credit. Who wouldn't like to take credit? But I really can't. I've just been very, 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 it sounds corny, but really very fortunate with the people that I've met, and all I got to do is open the door crack, and they run right through it.
And I think one note to end on, perhaps, if any of you have ever seen Ari, or if you see him in the future and meet him, he always has a pair of cowboy boots on, without fail. Maybe when did this start? Were you born with the little, the little baby boots on, or is this something you?
No, my parents are immigrants, and so the whole American thing was very big, And when I was growing up, you asked about what I wanted to be when I was a kid. I talked about astronauts. I also did want to be a cowboy. I also wanted to be Superman for a time, just because he seemed to always do the right thing. And that seemed like something that you wanted to do. And he also spoke to some principles that my folks told me that this country was about. For my mother, who was a refugee from Hitler's Europe, who was a survivor, so this was her promised land. So a lot of those abstracts that we all consider corny today were really what motivated her and what she inculcated us with. The two-dimensional cowboys of TV were my heroes because they did the right thing. They were two-dimensional, admittedly. They were not deep characters, not what I would hope to create perhaps in a novel. But there was something wonderful about them. They seemed to do the right thing, to take care of the other person. I think that's if someone was weaker, they didn't let them get too weak, and if someone got too strong, they stopped them from getting too strong. I think that's a good principle politically as well, right? Any society, you don't want a society that where people are allowed to get too weak, right? Because then you got to help them, or where people are allowed to get too strong. So I think that's a motivating factor. And so I got that from those Westerns. I like cowboy boots. It's probably also, from the time I grew up in, I think we all wore fringe jackets and fry boots, and I just never got over
Lower
it.
East Side Manhattan.
Yeah.
That was the look. Well, thank you so much, Ari. It was an absolute pleasure catching up with you, and I hopefully all the Completely Booked listeners got a little inspiration today as well. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. This was terrific.
Hi guys, thanks so much for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you like the podcast, the best way for others to hear it is for you to subscribe, share it, and leave us a comment on your podcast app.
And on last week's episode, we asked you to tell us your favorite historic spots in Jacksonville. And our favorite answer was the Florida Theater downtown. The theater was built in 1926. The architecture is incredible, and rumor has it the theater is allegedly haunted. So definitely check it out and see a show there if you haven't before.
Yes, and for this week, we want to know, what is your favorite creative medium? Are you a Renaissance man like Mark Ari, or do you have a favorite go-to creative outlet? Let us know on our social media pages at Jack's Library.
And to check out Ari's work, you can rent the ebook version of his novel, A Shoemaker's Tale, on Hoopla when you create a free account using your Jacksonville Public Library card. And we'll also link all of his other projects under podcasts at jackspubliclibrary.org.
Mark Ari also referenced Winnie the Pooh and Stephen King's On Writing, which are also available at the library.
And if you want to discover more Jacksonville writers, check out our local authors collection at the main library. Until next time, I'm Gabby.
And I'm Amanda. Bye, everyone.